Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to journey back with me, far beyond the familiar comforts of our modern world, into a twilight age where the great city of Rome, once the heart of an empire, began its long and painful descent into shadow. This is a tale not of emperors and battles alone, but of quiet tragedies, of farmers and mothers, of scribes and soldiers whose names never graced marble or scroll, yet whose lives bore the burden of history's turning tide. Over the next 22 parts, we'll walk gently through the ruinous years that marked the fall of Rome, when life itself grew harsh, uncertain, and heartbreakingly fragile. In this first chapter, let us begin at the edge of the waning Golden Age, when the old rhythms still clung to life and hope flickered, dimly, within the hearts of crumbling villas. The sun had not yet risen fully above the Apennines when the old man stirred from his sleep. His name was Lucius Calvus, and he lived near the riverbank where the land had once been rich with wheat and songbirds. The villa that now sheltered him had belonged to his father's father, back when Rome's legions marched in triumph and grain ships sailed from Africa without fear. But now the plaster walls were cracked, and ivy crept into the corners where once mosaic lions prowled beneath marble columns. The air was cool, with that ancient chill that comes just before dawn, and outside, a soft mist clung low to the ground like a memory reluctant to lift. Lucius's joints ached as they always did, not with the clean pain of labor, but with the slow, insistent grip of age, of years measured in failed harvests and stolen oxen. He sat up carefully, listening not to the birdsong which had grown scarce, but to silence. A silence that had become familiar in the last decade, no longer broken by the clatter of carts or the laughter of neighbors. Only the river still spoke, its voice a whisper now, running low from a summer that had been too dry. He pulled his woolen shawl tighter around him and rose. In the hearth, embers still glowed faintly. He coaxed them back to life with practiced ease, feeding in dry twigs that snapped with a sound like brittle bones. There was no oil for the lamp, and candles were rare. Firelight would suffice. From a shelf, he took a small crust of bread, stale and gray at the edges. No olives today, nor cheese. Those had become luxuries. Still, he bowed his head in silence, offering thanks not with words, but with the hollow reverence of one who remembered better days. The year was 409 after Christ. Though few in the countryside marked time so precisely anymore, calendars had faded with the legions. What mattered now was the harvest, the weather, and whether the roads remained passable, or if the bandits had come again. News from the cities arrived slowly, passed from traveler to traveler like a fading rumor. There had been talk of a Visigoth chieftain, Alaric was his name, marching once more toward Rome. Some said the city had been sacked already, others claimed the emperor had fled. Lucius did not know what to believe. All he knew was that merchants no longer came down the road to barter cloth for barley. He stepped outside. The mist curled around his ankles as he made his way to the field. Once 20 men had worked this land. Now only he and his nephew remained. Young Marcus was strong but careless, and the boy's eyes drifted too often toward the western hills where the smoke of other farms could sometimes be seen, whether from hearths or fire, one could not say. Lucius knelt by the earth, brushing back the cracked soil with a calloused hand. The wheat had failed again. It was the blight, black tips on golden stalks that yielded no grain. He sighed, and as he did, a faint sound stirred behind him. Hooves. He stood sharply, turning. Down the ridge, 2 riders approached, their silhouettes blurred in the morning light. He could not see their colors, but their bearing was wrong. Not like the old Roman patrols, who once wore red cloaks and polished bronze. These men slouched in the saddle, cloaked in rough wool, their swords visible and unsheathed. Lucius did not flee. There was nowhere to run. Instead, he waited, his eyes narrowed. When the riders drew close, one raised a hand in greeting, or perhaps warning. They did not speak Latin, not at first. One of them pointed to the barn, the other gestured toward Lucius's satchel. A few words were exchanged, broken, rough Latin learned by trade or conquest. They were hungry, they said, travelers, looking for shelter. He nodded slowly, the way a tree bends to wind, and led them toward the barn. That night, they remained. They took nothing more than a few turnips and some water, but their eyes watched everything. The cracks in the walls, the way Lucius limped, the fact that only one young man was left to defend the house. They did not say who they were, nor where they came from, and in the morning they were gone. But after that, Marcus stopped sleeping deeply. He began leaving the tools out at night, just in case. And Lucius, though old, began sleeping with a blade beneath his blanket. For even in the countryside, far from Rome's crumbling walls, life was no longer lived in ease. The world had shifted, and with it the old rules had fallen away like autumn leaves before a storm. That winter came early, and with it the wolves. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another night. Let us rest now. Let your eyes grow heavy with the rhythm of fading hearth fires and distant rivers, for we are only just beginning our long and gentle walk through the twilight of an empire. The first frost of the season arrived not with fanfare, but with a hush, an invisible breath over the hills that turned leaves brittle and silvered the fields under moonlight. In the valley below Lucius's villa, the reeds by the river shivered, and the shallow waters slowed. Somewhere in the distant woods, a wolf howled. Not boldly, not with menace, but with a hollow note, like sorrow-given voice. Marcus had risen before the sun, though sleep had been restless. Since the strangers had come, he had taken to waking at intervals through the night, rising with his spear in hand to peer through the shutters, ears straining for footsteps or hooves. He was not a soldier, not truly. He had never worn armor or stood in a line with men at arms. But he was young and strong, and felt the stirrings of duty, however dimly kindled. That morning he walked the perimeter of the land, spear in one hand, a piece of stale bread in the other. The barn was intact. The sheep, few as they were, remained. Yet something felt changed, as though the land itself were waiting. By midday, the old man joined him. Lucius said little, but his gaze drifted constantly to the tree line. He remembered, as the old often do, what others had forgotten. The winter wolves were not new. In the days of his youth, they had come only rarely, thin and desperate, howling at distant mountain passes. But now the balance had shifted. Rome's hunters no longer culled the packs, and with each season, the creatures crept closer to human homes. That night, they barred the door with a U-beam and banked the fire high with split logs. Lucius lit a tallow candle, one of only 3 they possessed, and sat close by its light, rubbing oil into the blade of his old gladius. The sword was Roman, forged in Hispania when such things were still crafted in plenty. Its edge was nicked, but it held a quiet promise. Outside, the wind rose, thin and sharp, and then faintly came the sound again. A howl. Not far, not this time. Somewhere beyond the barn, near the line of frost-bleached olive trees. Marcus gripped his spear and moved to the window, heart quickening. They waited in silence for what felt like hours. Yet nothing came. The candle burned low, the fire hissed. Eventually, Lucius slept. Marcus did not. At dawn, they found the first signs. Prints in the soil near the henhouse, narrow and deep. One hen was gone. Another lay half-eaten near the steps. The wolves had come. For the next days, the men of the villa lived in a kind of hushed alertness. Traps were laid. The barn was reinforced with broken timber. Fires were kept burning at the perimeter long into the night. But always, the wolves remained just out of reach, close enough to remind them of their presence, far enough to elude retaliation. Food began to dwindle, and then came the stranger. It was on the 8th day after the first howl when he arrived, walking the road from the south, wrapped in a thick cloak of dark brown wool. He bore no weapon visible, but walked with the heavy gait of one accustomed to hardship. His face was hooded, but his voice, when he spoke, was clear and oddly formal. "I seek shelter," he said, standing just beyond the gate. "Only for the night. I have coin." Lucius studied him carefully. There was something in the man's bearing, not threatening but unsettling. He did not look like a peasant nor a soldier. His boots were worn, but of good make, and though his beard was unkempt, his eyes were sharp. "We have little," Lucius replied at last, "but a place near the hearth, if that suffices." The stranger bowed his head. That night, he sat with them by the fire, eating slowly, gratefully. Marcus asked where he was from. The man spoke of the south, of Capua, perhaps, or Beneventum. It was hard to tell if he lied. He said he was once a scribe, then a tutor, then something else altogether. He said the roads had grown dangerous, and then he spoke of Rome. "It's not gone," he said, watching the flames. "Not yet, but it bleeds. The old ways are fading. The Senate barely meets. The grain ships don't come. The city, it's hollowing." Lucius stared at the hearth. "Do they still fight?" The stranger nodded. Yes and no. Some fight for honor, some for coin, some fight because they know nothing else, and some simply wait. And the emperor? A boy, the man said quietly, a boy with too many shadows. Later, when the fire had burned low and Marcus had drifted into a doze, the stranger turned to Lucius. You've heard them, he said. The wolves. Lucius did not answer. They do not come only for meat, the man said. They follow the cracks, the fractures. They can sense when a house no longer believes in its walls. Lucius narrowed his eyes. What are you? The stranger did not smile. He only shrugged. A man who walks the roads and listens. The next morning he was gone. No sound, no farewell. Only a coin left on the mantel, silver, old, stamped with the profile of a forgotten emperor. And that night, the wolves came again. This time, they were not shy. 3 of them approached the barn just after dusk, and Marcus, hearing the growls, ran out with torch in hand. The creatures did not flee at once. They watched him with eyes like green fire, moving only when Lucius appeared behind the boy, sword drawn. One wolf was struck, not killed, but wounded. The others vanished into the dark. But the message was clear. The peace of the land had broken. The line between man and beast, civilization and wildness, had thinned. And far to the north, where the rivers ran colder and the hills grew steep, darker things stirred. Things with names that still echoed faintly in Roman memory, names that carried the taste of ash and iron. The world was changing, and for those who remained in its fragile corners, the days ahead would be marked not by glory, but by endurance. We shall speak more of that when next we gather. But for now, let the fire burn low and the night deepen. Let us rest in the soft quiet between stories, where even the wolves cannot follow. The days grew shorter as autumn collapsed into winter, and the sky remained perpetually gray, as if cloaked in mourning. Each morning brought a film of ice upon the well bucket, and the breath of both man and beast lingered like ghosts in the air. The earth, once warm and golden under the Roman sun, had hardened into something that no longer welcomed the footstep. There were no more figs on the trees, and the few apples that remained were pocked with frost. In the villa by the river, Lucius and Marcus took turns tending the hearth. The logs they had stockpiled were dwindling, and more than once, Marcus had to venture into the woods, wary of wolves and worse. The barn had been reinforced again, but the animals inside were nervous. Even the sheep bleated less, as though they too sensed the shifting balance. The coin the stranger had left remained untouched. It sat upon the mantel like a relic from another world, its silver dulled with age. Lucius looked at it often, not for its value, but for what it represented, a time when currency had meaning, when order could be bought and borders held firm. One morning, as a snowless but bitter wind cut through the valley, a rider passed along the road beyond the villa. He did not stop. His cloak was blood-stained, and his horse limped. He bore no banner. From the ridge, Marcus watched him go, his heart caught between curiosity and dread. The rider looked back once, briefly, but said nothing. Then he vanished into the trees. Lucius said nothing of it, but that night he placed the gladius closer to his bed, and so the rhythm of survival continued. No longer was there thought of thriving. Each day was marked by hunger, each night by vigilance. Yet there was still a kind of grace to it, a ritual quietness in how they moved, how they spoke only what was needed, how they listened to the wind. On the 7th night after the stranger's departure, the villa was visited again, but not by wolves nor men. It was Marcus who saw it first. He had gone to the shed to fetch a broken barrel stave for kindling. As he crossed the yard, he paused, squinting toward the far edge of the field. There, amid the frost-covered reeds, stood a figure. It was a woman, or the shape of one, dressed in a long gray cloak that fluttered faintly despite the still air. Her hair, if it was hair, seemed to float like mist. She did not move, but neither did she vanish. Marcus called out, but received no answer. He returned to the house, lips pale, words halting. Lucius listened, then rose, slow and deliberate. He stepped into his boots and wrapped his cloak tight. When he reached the edge of the field, the figure was gone. But in the snowless frost beneath the olive trees, there were no footprints. Back in the villa, Marcus asked what he had seen. Lucius did not answer directly. Instead, he stirred the fire and whispered of a tale from his youth, of the Domina Alba, the white lady of the thinning times. A spirit said to appear when old ways falter, when the world teeters upon the brink. She was neither evil nor kind. She was simply a herald. Marcus laughed, nervously. He had not heard such tales since childhood, but Lucius did not laugh. The next day, a cold rain fell, a hard, slanting rain that washed away the frost and turned the roads to muck. A storm brewed low in the western sky, and by afternoon, it arrived in full. It was during this storm that a second visitor came, though not to the villa itself. At the edge of the woods, Marcus found a man seated upon a stone beneath a bent cedar tree. He was half frozen, eyes glassy, his hands trembling around a strip of cloth wrapped around his abdomen. Blood had soaked through. Lucius and Marcus dragged him to the barn. He was young, perhaps no more than 20, and wore remnants of a Roman uniform. A broken standard lay beside him, the eagle half scratched away. He spoke little, murmuring only the word Amona again and again. Lucius knew the name, a town across the sea in what had once been Pannonia, far, far to the northeast. As they cleaned his wound and wrapped him in wool, Marcus asked what had happened. The young man, feverish and fading, spoke in fragments, of a road choked with mud and fleeing families, of armored riders with long spears, of something terrible moving down from the Danube. They don't ride for Rome, he whispered. They ride for fire. That night he died, and they buried him in the orchard, under the oldest fig tree. Lucius placed the broken eagle atop the mound, but covered it with soil. There were no more legions to mourn, and the eagle, once a symbol of dominion, had become a relic of forgotten thunder. As the days passed, the storm gave way to deeper cold. The river froze at its edges, and in the quiet, Lucius began speaking more often, not of the present, but of the past, of the roads that had once stretched to the edge of the known world, of the law that had bound men across oceans, of a time when his father had spoken Latin in distant markets and been understood. Marcus listened, though much of it felt like myth. And one night, as the wind howled and the fire dwindled, Lucius whispered something he had never said aloud. "I think the gods have gone." Marcus said nothing. "They left when we stopped believing in the covenant," Lucius said. "Not the temples, the covenant between man and man, when justice gave way to hunger and roads turned to ash." Outside, the wolves howled again. But inside the villa, the two men sat side by side, firelight flickering across the old sword and the silver coin. And somewhere in the dark, just beyond the edge of memory, the empire crumbled a little further into silence. The snow arrived not with ceremony, but in silence, thin flakes drifting from a leaden sky, brushing the stone walls and brittle vines of the old villa like ash from a funeral pyre. It fell lightly at first, a hush upon the earth, and then more steadily, burying the fields, the orchard, the path to the river. Soon, the landscape that had once held color, memory, and movement lay still beneath a white shroud. Lucius stood at the threshold, watching the snowfall with quiet solemnity. His breath rose in puffs, soft against the bitter wind. Somewhere in the distance, a single crow called, its voice lost quickly in the cold. Inside, Marcus paced. He had repaired the shutters, checked the traps, and counted their provisions for the third time. Salted meat, some millet, the last of the dried apples. Not enough. The loss of the sheep to the wolves had cost them dearly. Now, with the road impassable and the land cloaked in frost, survival would depend upon caution and perhaps luck. They no longer lit the hearth during the day. It drew attention, consumed fuel too quickly. Only at dusk did they allow the flames to rise. By then, the cold had crept into the bones of the house, and they huddled close together, wrapped in cloaks, speaking little. It was on such an evening, 3 days after the snow's arrival, that a sound broke through the stillness. At first, it seemed part of the wind, then like the cry of a child. But it was no child, a horn, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Lucius stiffened. Marcus looked up from his place near the fire. "Do you hear it?" Lucius nodded. They extinguished the flames quickly, plunging the room into shadow. Then, moving carefully, they made their way to the upper floor. From a narrow slit in the shutter, Lucius peered out across the snowy field. And then he saw them. Not many, perhaps a dozen. Moving along the old road in single file, dark shapes against the snow, hoods drawn, weapons slung across their backs. Not soldiers, not merchants. Too silent, too loose in their discipline. Raiders, most likely, or deserters bound for warmer lands. Their faces were hidden, but the way they moved spoke of fatigue and hunger and danger. Lucius drew back. "We don't draw attention," he whispered. "They're just passing." But even as he said it, he knew the fragility of that hope. The column paused near the bend in the road. One of the figures pointed toward the villa. Another shook his head. A third raised the horn again, but did not sound it. Instead, they conferred in low tones, and then, mercifully, they moved on. The two men waited until the dark swallowed the last of the travelers before returning below. That night, they did not sleep. By morning, new footprints marked the road, deeper impressions, signs of heavy boots. And near the edge of the orchard, one set veered off briefly before returning to the main path, a scout perhaps, or someone curious. Either way, the message was clear. The villa had been seen. Marcus asked if they should flee, abandon the house, hide in the woods. Lucius shook his head. The forest was colder, crueler, and offered no shelter. The villa, broken though it was, still stood. And within it, memories, warmth, and the last traces of a home. Instead, they began to prepare. The remaining oil was poured into a shallow basin and set near the door. If attackers came, it would serve as fire. The shutters were reinforced with rope and iron nails. Food was gathered into sacks, easier to flee with if needed. Lucius unearthed a small cache beneath the floorboards, 3 rusted pila, Roman javelins wrapped in cloth, relics of an older time. He handed one to Marcus and kept another for himself. "Steel remembers," he said quietly, "even when men forget." That evening, the snow ceased, leaving a stillness so profound it seemed unnatural. Not a bird called, nor branch stirred. The wind itself held its breath. And then came the knocking. Not loud, not urgent, but deliberate. 3 knocks, then silence. Lucius motioned for Marcus to stay back. He approached the door slowly, javelin in hand. Another knock followed, lighter this time, almost hesitant. He opened the door a sliver. Standing outside was a boy, no more than 12, pale-faced, barefoot, wrapped in a torn cloak that dragged behind him like a funerary shroud. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with exhaustion. He held no weapon. "I was told to come here," he said, his voice hoarse. Lucius stared. "By whom?" The boy looked over his shoulder, then back again. The man with the silver eyes. Lucius felt the weight of that answer settle upon him like fresh snow. He stepped aside. Inside, the boy collapsed near the hearth, his limbs trembling. Marcus fetched him water, which he drank in silence. He would not say his name, only that he had fled from the mountains, from a village that no longer stood. "They came in the night," he murmured. "They burned the barns, took the women. The men who fought were nailed to the doors." Lucius closed his eyes. "Who were they?" The boy shivered. "I don't know. They didn't speak Latin. They wore pieces of armor, but not Roman. Some had paint on their faces. One had a necklace of ears." The silence that followed was complete. Later, after the boy had fallen asleep, wrapped in Marcus's old cloak, Lucius stepped outside. The snow was crisp underfoot, the stars dim behind a veil of cloud. And far in the distance, just barely perceptible, he saw it. A flicker of firelight along the northern ridge. Not lightning, not campfires, a village burning. He stood there a long while, the cold pressing against him like memory. Then he turned back to the villa, to the boy, and to the fire that still held its fragile warmth. The storm was no longer coming. It had arrived. Snow fell once more upon the hills, gentler this time, in a slow, swirling dance beneath the heavy breath of twilight. It settled upon the broken stones of the road, softened the jagged remnants of cartwheels abandoned near the orchard, and cloaked the villa's sagging roof in a purity that belied the truth of what lay beneath. From a distance, the land seemed peaceful, still, even beautiful. But within the villa's crumbling walls, peace had become a stranger's face, half remembered and never truly trusted. The boy, now warmed and fed, had begun to speak more in fragments, half dreams, half recollections. His name, he finally revealed, was Elias, a name once worn by senators, now carried by a child in tattered wool. His village, long nameless to any map, had nestled in the lower Apennines, a cluster of thatched roofs and goats. One day, without warning, riders had descended from the forest paths, silent, swift, brutal. There were no banners, no warnings, only fire and the thud of hooves and the shrieks of women dragged from their homes. "They weren't like other raiders," Elias whispered one night. "They didn't take food or gold, just people, and then they burned everything." Lucius listened in silence, staring into the hearth. "The man with silver eyes saved me. He came from nowhere, pointed me to the road. Told me to find the old house by the river. Marcus glanced at his uncle, but Lucius said nothing. The boy slept deeply now, curled like a fox near the fire. He spoke sometimes in his sleep, words that meant nothing, names long lost. Marcus covered him with an extra cloak and sat back, chin resting on the haft of his spear. It was then that Lucius spoke. When I was young, there was a story we heard often, told by the soldiers who came back from the edges of the empire, about the Servitium Umbrae, the servants of the shadow. Raiders, yes, but not for plunder. They took captives to feed darker rites. No proof, of course, only whispers. Rome dismissed them as superstition. Do you believe it? Lucius shrugged. Now I believe in many things I once laughed at. The next morning dawned with an uneasy stillness. The snow had stopped, but a mist clung low to the ground, rolling over the fields in silent waves. The air smelled faintly of iron. Marcus ventured out early to check the traps near the river bend. When he returned, he was pale and silent. There's something, he said, by the eastern boundary. Lucius followed him through the orchard, boots crunching over the frost. At the edge of the property, where the land dipped into a narrow gully, they saw it, a tree, and from it, a man hanging upside down, stripped of his garments, arms bound behind him, throat cut from ear to ear. His blood had drained into the snow below, creating a dark, frozen pool. On his chest, carved crudely with a blade, was a symbol, an inverted crescent, intersected by 3 lines. Neither Lucius nor Marcus had seen its like before. They cut the man down and buried him quickly, saying no prayers. The symbol haunted them. Not Roman, not Gothic, not of any known tongue or tribe. We're being watched, Marcus said. They want us to know. Lucius did not disagree. That night, no fire was lit. They ate cold barley and dried meat, then sat in silence, weapons close at hand. Aelius slept restlessly, his small frame twitching with dreams. Outside, the wind returned, not loud, but constant, threading through the cracks in the shutters like whispered warnings. And then came the bell. A single chime, far off, faint, but unmistakable. Lucius stood quickly. That's not ours. Marcus listened, heart thudding. Another chime followed, then another, slowly, methodically, a traveler's bell. But none in the region used bells anymore. The churches were empty, the shepherds dead or fled, and the monasteries, those that still stood, had gone silent seasons ago. They climbed to the loft and peered toward the ridge. There, on the old Roman road, a light bobbed, lantern or torch, and beside it, a mounted figure. The bell hung from his saddle. He moved slowly as though searching. Lucius recognized the gait of the horse. Wounded, labored. The figure stopped at the orchard's edge, then turned and vanished into the trees. No one slept that night. Come morning, they found the tracks, hoof prints, deep and erratic. But no footprints, as if the rider had not dismounted or had no weight at all. They said nothing of it to Aelius. Instead, they reinforced the barn, moved their supplies again, and began to sleep in shifts. Every night brought new sounds, cracks, whispers, the distant cry of something neither man nor beast. The fire was no longer a comfort, but a necessity. And still, the symbol haunted Lucius. He etched it from memory into a plank of wood and studied it beneath the lantern's glow. He had once studied letters, had copied scrolls in his youth. He knew the shapes of Carthage, the runes of the Norsemen, even the curling sigils of far Arabia. But this was older, cruder, not a word, a mark, a warning, or a claim. Winter held the land in its icy grip. And though the snow now fell less frequently, the cold deepened. The river froze more each day. The wolves had vanished. Not slain, driven away. Something else was coming. And whatever it was, it did not ride under any known banner. It rode with silence, with fire, and with the echo of a bell that rang from no church. The mist never lifted that week. It hung thick and low like sorrow draped over the valley, blurring the trees and cloaking the villa in a breathless gray. No sun pierced it, nor moon shone through its veil. It muffled all sound, made even the crunch of footsteps seem distant, uncertain. The world felt smaller, as if the sky had pressed closer to the earth, bringing with it a weight that even breath could not escape. Inside the villa, the air had grown stale despite the cold. Smoke from the hearth clung to the rafters. The windows, covered in waxed cloth and wool scraps, let in little light. Aelius had grown quieter, his bright eyes dimming into something more withdrawn. He barely spoke unless asked directly, and even then his answers were brief, as though speaking cost him something. Lucius began recording again, not with ink, long since dried, but by etching small notes into thin shards of wood. Names, dates, symbols, fragments of memory. He hid them beneath a loose floorstone in the storage room. "Someone should remember," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "If no one remembers, it will be as if we never lived." Marcus, meanwhile, patrolled the grounds with increasing regularity. He had grown leaner, his face more shadowed. Every creak of the old villa's timbers made his fingers twitch toward the javelin. He no longer dreamed, or if he did not speak of it. He had become a man shaped by watchfulness, forged in the long silence between attacks. It was on the fourth night of the mist's reign that the scratching began. At first, they thought it was mice or branches dragging across the walls. But the pattern was too steady, too deliberate. A slow, methodical scraping, like a blade against stone. It came from beneath the villa, from the cellar. Lucius gathered his torch and descended first, Marcus close behind. The stairs groaned, and the air grew colder with each step. The cellar was mostly empty now, once used to store wine and grain, now home only to dust, cobwebs, and memories. The scratching ceased the moment they stepped into the chamber. They searched every corner, every barrel, every stone. Nothing. But in the farthest alcove where damp had turned the brick black, they found something new. A mark. The same symbol. Inverted crescent, 3 intersecting lines, etched freshly into the wall. Lucius stared at it a long while. "They've been here," Marcus whispered. "No," Lucius replied. "They are here." They sealed the cellar that night, barred it with wood and prayer. The mist thickened. Each day the food diminished. The salted meat had turned. The millet was damp. Aelius refused to eat at times, staring at the hearth with unfocused eyes. He spoke again of dreams, shadows with hands, voices without mouths. "Don't look at the windows at night," he whispered once. "If you see them looking back, they'll know you see." Marcus began sleeping by the door. Lucius took to murmuring the old prayers, half Christian, half Roman. Names of saints mixed with invocations to Janus and Vesta. He did not know which gods, if any, still listened, but he spoke to all of them. On the 7th day, Marcus did not return from patrol. He had gone at dawn, spear in hand, to check the traps near the southern grove. The sun never rose, only that endless swallowing mist. Lucius waited. An hour, 2, then 3. Finally, with a blade at his hip and torch in hand, he stepped into the fog. The world outside was white and gray and silent. Trees loomed like statues. The path was barely visible. He called for Marcus. No answer. Not even the sound of birds. Not even the wind. Then faintly he heard it. Breathing, not his own. Slow, ragged. And there, not 10 paces away, stood Marcus, or what remained of him. His face was pale, streaked with blood from a deep gash across his brow. His eyes were glassy, and his hands trembled. He held no weapon. His cloak was gone. He collapsed before Lucius could speak. Back in the villa, Aelius helped tend the wound. Marcus said little, only that he had been walking the path when the mist thickened. Shapes moved in the trees. Voices called his name, but never from the same place. Then came the bells. Not one, but many. Soft at first, then louder. Then, inside his head. He ran, he said, but the path kept turning. The world folded in on itself. He had no memory of finding his way back. That night, the 3 of them sat together, none daring to close their eyes. Lucius stared at the fire and remembered the old tales, of the fogs that rolled in before battlefields were swallowed, of voices that lured men into the woods never to return. Wives had called such tales nonsense. Priests had dismissed them as pagan lies. But Rome had always dismissed what it feared. The mist held for 2 more days. Then suddenly it lifted, swept away by a biting wind from the north. But with its departure came another sound, a horn, low, steady, distant, but drawing closer. Not a war horn, not a Roman cornu. This was deeper, more primal, and it echoed across the valley like the voice of something waking. They looked at one another, not speaking, and outside, far across the fields, the first fires began to rise. Not from the hearths of neighbors, but from torches, many torches, moving slowly, deliberately, toward the villa. The fires glowed on the horizon like angry stars, threading through the darkness with unnatural rhythm. They moved not like scattered wanderers, but in lines, measured, purposeful, too orderly for mere bandits. There was no shouting, no sound of hooves or clattering armor, only the low throb of that unearthly horn, rising and falling like a breath drawn from beneath the earth itself. From the villa's rooftop, Lucius watched. The torches were still a league off, but closing steadily. He counted them, dozens, perhaps more, weaving down the old Roman road. In life, he had witnessed legions pass by in parades of strength. This was not that. This was something else, a procession of ruin. Below, Marcus had recovered enough to stand, his face ashen but his grip steady upon the spear. Aelius sat near the hearth, wide-eyed, his arms wrapped around his knees. The boy had not spoken since the horn first sounded. It was as if he had been waiting for it, dreading it, and now that it had arrived, a silence had taken hold within him too deep to break. Lucius came down the ladder from the loft, his expression hard. "They'll reach us by dawn." "Can we run?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Not with the boy, not through snow, and not with whatever walks behind those torches. They began preparations, not frantic, not in panic, but with a grim steadiness. Lucius retrieved the last of the pitch from the storage urn. Marcus placed torches at each corner of the roof. They barred the windows with thicker timber and scattered caltrops near the thresholds. The oil basin by the door was filled and set alight, flickering with blue flame. Then Lucius took a bundle from the old chest beneath his bed. Wrapped in it was a Roman standard, faded and moth-eaten, bearing the eagle and SPQR. It had not flown in decades. He affixed it above the doorway. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Lucius only said, "Let them know we remember." By midnight, the flames were closer, visible now not only as dots but as figures. The mist had cleared and the sky showed no stars, only darkness above and fire below. They could see the first shapes. Men, or things that resembled men, hooded and cloaked, some carrying curved blades, others dragging carts or bound figures. Not an army, a procession. As though a court of judgment moved through the countryside, weighing each place it passed. Then came the drums, low like a heartbeat in the marrow. 4 beats, a pause, 4 beats again, steady, unnerving. Inside the villa, Lucius sat beside Aelius. "You must stay hidden," he said softly. "Do not leave the storeroom, not unless the fire reaches you." The boy nodded once. Lucius handed him a small knife. "Not to fight," he said, "to keep hope. Sometimes the feel of steel is enough." Aelius clutched it with trembling hands. Marcus took position at the east window where the road curved past the barn. Lucius remained near the front, gladius across his knees, the standard above him fluttering faintly in the cold wind. Then at last, the torchbearers reached the base of the hill. They did not speak. They did not shout. They only stopped. The horn sounded once more. Then silence. From among the figures, one stepped forward. He wore no cloak, only a robe of deep blue stitched with silver thread. His head was shaven, but his face bore symbols, lines cut into the flesh, not painted. His eyes gleamed with something that was not light. Lucius stepped forward. The figure raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that was both command and invitation. Lucius did not move. "You shelter what is not yours," the man said, his voice carried too clearly for the distance. "A child marked, a place unbound." Marcus raised his spear. Lucius's voice was steady. "This is Roman land." The figure smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "There is no Rome." He gestured behind him, and from the ranks came forth a cart, drawn by 2 pale oxen. Upon it stood a kind of altar, bones lashed with gold wire, fragments of faces sculpted in wax. Around it hung bells, small, delicate, chiming with each movement. "This land is called," the man said. "We are the answer." Lucius gripped the gladius tighter. "You'll find no passage here." The man tilted his head. "You misunderstand. We do not seek passage. We seek cleansing." Then, with no further word, he turned, and the fires advanced. The first wave came silently, shapes flitting through the trees, leaping fences, climbing walls. They were fast, animal-like, moving with eerie coordination. Marcus shouted, casting his torch into the courtyard where a cluster gathered. Fire roared, and one screamed, a shrill, unnatural cry. Lucius swung his blade as the first intruder breached the door, a thin man with a smile too wide, his eyes milk-white. The gladius struck true, and he fell. Another followed, and another. The air filled with the sound of bells and drums and steel and breathing. The villa was no longer a home. It had become a battleground, and within its walls, 3 souls clung to the last remnants of light in a night that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. The air was thick with smoke and ash, the firelight casting monstrous shadows against the cracked walls of the villa. The old stones trembled underfoot as unseen figures scaled them. claws and boots alike scrambling for grip. The banners above the door, tattered and trembling, flapped in a frantic rhythm as if trying to speak some forgotten prayer. Lucius fought with the certainty of a man who no longer feared death. His movements were not quick, but precise, born of memory, not youth. Each swing of the gladius was measured, each thrust made with grim intent. The invaders came not in waves, but in whispers, gliding through doorways, crawling over rafters, slipping through cracks. They seemed to feel no pain, made no sounds save for the occasional hiss or rasping exhale, like the wind through dead leaves. At the eastern wall, Marcus held his ground with a broken javelin haft and a length of chain, repurposed from the barn gate. He fought not as a soldier, but as a man who knew that behind him lay everything he could not bear to lose. He struck low, slammed the window shutter shut as hands reached through, and drove a splintered stave into the throat of something too tall to be entirely human. The boy, Alias, remained hidden beneath the storage alcove, curled tightly, eyes wide open in the dark. He had not cried. The knife lay cold against his palm, and his ears rang not from battle, but from a high, constant tone, like the final, frozen note of a bell that never stopped chiming. The altar cart creaked closer, drawn by its ghost-pale oxen. The hooded figures chanted now, soft and rhythmic, their words foreign and broken, fragments of tongues older than Latin. Around the cart the smoke thickened, but it did not drift like wood fire. It writhed, alive, sentient, curling upward into the villa's roof like black ivy. Lucius saw it, even as he felled another attacker. His breath came in short gasps, his eyes stinging with sweat and ash. "Marcus!" he cried. Marcus, blood streaked across his temple, turned to look, and saw the smoke taking form. It coalesced above the courtyard, not solid but shaped. A figure, tall, robed, its face a void of swirling ash. Its arms were long, fingers ending not in nails but in points like bone knives. It did not move, but watched, as if judging, as if listening. Lucius felt a weight in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but a sorrow so deep it stilled his heart for a moment. "What is it?" Marcus gasped. "Not a man," Lucius whispered. "Not a god either." And then, without warning, the bells began again. Not from the altar, but from within the villa. A dozen small chimes from places unseen, behind the walls, beneath the floor, in the very rafters above their heads. Lucius froze. "They've marked the house." He turned to the hearth. "The fire. We must douse it." Marcus hesitated. "Why?" "It draws them. The warmth. The light. It calls them." Together they threw snow into the flames, burying the hearth in a plume of steam and sparks. Darkness rushed in. The moment the light died, the chimes ceased. And so did the attacks. The villa stood still. The silence that followed was not peace. It was expectation. Outside, the robed figures halted mid-step. The smoke figure above the courtyard seemed to sway, then recoil like a spider withdrawing from sudden light. The oxen stirred uneasily, the altar's bells falling quiet. Lucius stood at the threshold, sword lowered. Blood dripped from his forearm, but he paid it no mind. He stepped forward. "Leave this place," he said. No reply. But something moved behind the robed leader, the man with the carved face, a woman. Bound, cloaked, head down. Lucius's heart stilled. He knew that posture, that limp, that walk. "Cassia," he breathed. He took another step. The robed man raised a hand, not in warning, but in presentation. Cassia, once Lucius's daughter, long thought dead in the fires of Campania, looked up. Her eyes were white. No iris, no pupil, just milky voids. But her mouth moved. "Father." Lucius dropped the sword. The ground shifted beneath him, not physically but in memory, in grief. Cassia moved toward him, slowly, the bells on her wrists jangling softly, but Marcus grabbed Lucius's shoulder and pulled him back. "She's not." "I know," Lucius said, hollow. Still, he could not look away. The altar figure extended one arm toward Cassia, not threatening, inviting. Lucius understood. She was their offering, their herald, their proof. Not everything they took was lost. Some were given back, changed. "Why?" Lucius called out to the figure. It did not answer, but the bells resumed, slow, rhythmic, final. The procession turned. Just as silently as they had arrived, they began to depart, Cassia walking among them. At the hill's edge, she looked back. Lucius watched until the torchlight vanished. Only then did he fall to his knees. And above them, in the silence that followed, snow began to fall once more, softly, gently, like the end of a long breath. The villa stood wounded but untouched. A miracle or a warning? Neither man could say. The days that followed passed beneath a sky that seemed forever the color of old iron, neither stormy nor clear, but cold and watchful. A hush had settled over the land, not the gentle silence of snowfall, but a brittle stillness that made every footstep seem like an offense. The villa still stood, miraculously untouched in stone and timber, yet within its walls something had changed. The air was heavier. Shadows clung longer to the corners. And the warmth of the hearth no longer reached the soul as it once had. Lucius moved through his home with the careful steps of a man living among ghosts. He spoke little, ate less, and stared often at the door, as if expecting it to open and reveal the face that haunted him most. His daughter, Cassia, returned not as memory, but as she had stood on the hill beneath the banner of the unholy procession. Marcus had taken to long walks through the grounds, javelin ever in hand, his eyes scanning tree lines and rooftops. He found no more tracks, no more strange marks in the snow, but he never once let down his guard. He barely spoke to Lucius, but in the quiet moments, they shared glances that needed no words, acknowledgments of pain, of loyalty, and of the knowledge that something vast and ancient now stirred across the land. Aelius had grown different too, not outwardly, not in body, but in presence. He no longer flinched at night sounds. He no longer asked questions. Instead, he drew. Every day, with charcoal or the stub of a fire-hardened stick, he etched symbols and scenes upon broken bits of wood and clay. Some were of the altar, some of the void-faced specter in the sky. Others were more mysterious, labyrinths of thin, spiraling lines, towers with eyes, men whose feet melted into roots. When Lucius asked what they meant, Aelius only said, "I don't draw them. I remember them." It was on the 10th day after the procession's departure that the stillness began to change. Lucius was in the courtyard repairing the hinges of the grain shed when a strange scent touched the air, not the scent of decay or smoke, but of myrrh and honey, cloying and out of place. He paused, lifting his head to the wind, and heard a sound that hadn't been heard in many months. A bell, faint, distant, not the deep-throated horn from before. This was different, higher, gentler. It rang twice, then fell silent. Lucius did not follow it. Instead, he walked back into the house and barred the door behind him. That night, Marcus found something left at the eastern boundary of the property. A bundle, wrapped in waxed cloth, tied with a strip of red sinew. Inside was bread, still warm, and a single note carved into bark, written in Latin so old and stilted it read like a spell. For those who remain in defiance, the second circle has begun. They burned the bread, the note they buried beneath stones. The next night, the stars returned, after nearly 2 weeks of obscured sky. They came not in scattered constellations, but in strange patterns, with new stars shining where none had before. Marcus stared at them for hours. Aelius would not look at them at all. "We must leave," Marcus said at last, "now, while we still can." Lucius nodded, not because he agreed, but because something in him had quietly broken. He no longer believed they could hide. "Where?" he asked. Aelius, without looking up from the fire, answered, "There's a monastery in the southern hills, behind the ruins of the Legion fort." Marcus frowned. "How do you—" "I saw it, before the procession came. White walls, bells made of stone. They don't speak there, but they remember." That evening they prepared. They packed what little remained, dried roots, salted fat, oilcloths for warmth. Lucius wrapped his gladius in linen and placed it in the satchel. Marcus took the javelin. Aelius carried nothing but the wooden disc he had carved with the spiral eye and crescent mark, 2 symbols joined as one. They left the villa under the pale starlight, walking silently through snow that had turned to crust. Behind them, the house stood still, its roof sagging under ice, its doorway dark. Lucius paused once at the threshold, placing his hand upon the stone. There was no farewell in his touch, only memory. And then they stepped into the woods. The path south was unfamiliar, overgrown with root and thorn, where no road had been trodden in a generation. But Aelius walked ahead as if led by something unseen. He never hesitated. He did not tire. That night, they camped beneath a leaning pine. Lucius did not sleep, neither did Marcus, and far off in the woods where the fire could not reach, the bell rang again. This time, 3 times, and the echo did not fade. By the 10th winter of Emperor Honorius's reign, the warmth of Roman promise had all but departed from the frontiers of the empire. Gone were the legions whose mere presence once quieted barbarian dreams. Gone, too, were the bustling trade routes that stitched the provinces together like fine embroidery. In their place stood silence, suspicion, and sorrow. The people who remained clung not to the might of Rome, but to memory, and even that, frayed as it was, could not shelter them from the storm. In a crumbling village, not far from the shattered city of Augusta Treverorum, what we now call Trier, there lived a woman named Petronia. She was once the daughter of a provincial magistrate, her childhood laced with honey-sweet figs, marbled villas, and lessons in Virgil's verses. But now, in the gray years that followed the breaking of the Rhine limes, Petronia was no longer a scholar's daughter, nor a matron of grace. She was simply a widow, wrapped in wool too thin for the weather, guarding her chickens against the night. Petronia's world was shrinking, month by month. Her neighbors had fled to the forested hills or been taken by sickness and sword. The fields once sowed by bonded laborers lay barren, overgrown with thistle and the bones of last year's harvest. The roads, those proud veins of Roman might, were unsafe to tread after dusk. Even the church, with its cracked icons and hollow pews, stood more like a mausoleum than a refuge. And yet, Petronia endured. She fed her chickens crushed barley and warmed her home with scavenged timber. She read, on winter evenings, from a scroll she had hidden beneath a broken hearthstone, lines of Ovid and prayers in Latin, barely legible now from age and smoke. It was her link to a past that seemed, even to her, like a dream from someone else's sleep. But one morning, while smoke still curled from her hearth and the frost still clung to the shutters, a boy arrived at her door. He was no older than 10, wrapped in rags, his hair matted with leaves and soot. He carried a wooden staff, far too tall for him, and he spoke in a mixture of Frankish and Latin, his words bruised by accent and fear. "My name is Ebrulf," he said. "The woods are empty, and I have not eaten in 2 days." Petronia looked at the boy, at the lines of dirt beneath his eyes, and something in her heart moved, not with pity, but with kinship. She knew what it was to be rootless, to be forgotten by the world. She opened her door, and in doing so, she opened her life to a child who had known only chaos and hunger. Ebrulf was no Roman. He had been born to a tribe of mixed blood, raised between the edges of empire and the shadows of wandering bands. His parents, he said, had been slain by Alemanni raiders. He had fled south, following the crumbling milestones of Roman roads, hoping that the stories were true, that somewhere the eagle still flew and bread was still warm. Petronia did not correct him. She offered him barley porridge and a place near the hearth. She mended his cloak with strips from an old curtain, and in the silence of those frost-bitten nights, she taught him Latin words for light, home, and hope. The days grew longer, and with them, Ebrulf's cheeks found color. He learned to tend chickens and gather dry moss for fire. He listened as Petronia told him of Rome, not the Rome of marble palaces and senators, but the Rome of law, of order, of morning prayers and evening lamps. To the boy, it was like a bedtime tale. To the woman, it was a liturgy of what once had been. But the world beyond their cottage did not sleep. In the hills to the east, the Franks were on the move. Not just raiding parties, but entire clans, men, women, children, displaced by hunger, by war, by dreams of fertile land. Rome had left a vacuum, and in that void, the old boundaries blurred. The Franks settled where Romans once farmed, and those Romans who remained found themselves either forced to flee, forced to kneel, or forced to become something new. One dusk, as the snow began to melt and the wind carried the scent of damp pine, a fire was seen on the distant ridge. Not lightning, nor festival, but a pyre, likely kindled by bandits or scouts. Ebrulf saw it first, and his voice trembled as he pointed it out. "They're coming," he whispered. Petronia stood beside him. Her hands, now thin and knotted with time, rested on the boy's shoulder. "Then we shall be ready," she said softly, "not with sword, but with soul." That night, she gathered what little she had, salted beans, dried roots, the last of the goat's milk, and packed it into a basket. She gave Ebrulf her husband's old belt knife, still rusted but sharp. And then she opened the hearthstone, and from beneath it pulled not just the scroll, but a small wooden cross wrapped in linen. "This," she said, "was my mother's. It saw her through the Antonine plague. Perhaps it will see you through this." Ebrulf clutched the cross as though it burned with invisible fire. But when the night passed, no raiders came. Only silence. stillness. A new day, unpromised, yet theirs. And so they endured again. Through Ibrolf and Petronia, we glimpse the quiet brutality of those days, not in grand battles or sacked cities, but in the daily gamble of survival. For each soul who perished, another clung on. For every ruin, there was one cottage still warm with the light of human hope. And in that light, Rome lingered, not as empire, but as memory. In the months that followed, the air changed. It was not the warmth of spring alone that stirred the birds from the trees and melted the frost from the thatch. It was something quieter, something heavier. The weight of movement in the lands beyond, the distant shuffle of peoples displaced, of fates redrawn. The hills grew restless, and even the animals seemed to sense that something ancient was unraveling, thread by weary thread. Petronia and Ebrulf continued their modest life within the little cottage of worn stones and lichen-covered beams. The chickens laid fewer eggs now, and the wild hares they once snared with twine had grown scarce, perhaps hunted away by others who too knew hunger's bite. Each meal was an act of quiet prayer. Each night spent in safety was an unspoken gift. Ebrulf had grown bolder. He learned the woods, its trails, its hidden burrows, the way the moss leaned northward on the trunks. He fashioned a sling from scraps of leather and began to bring back small birds, squirrels, once even a badger. His pride was a quiet one, shared only in the flicker of his eyes and the way he offered Petronia the choicest pieces of meat. She, in turn, taught him letters, traced with soot on smooth bark spoken gently beside the fire. A for Aquila, eagle. B for bellum, war. C for civitas, the city. Each word held a memory, each syllable a tether to a world that once had rules, roads, reasons. But no matter how fiercely they guarded their routine, the outer world pressed closer. Travelers began to appear, strange, hollow-eyed figures who moved not in single file but in bands. Not soldiers, but something warier. Families, tattered and gaunt, pushing carts of broken goods or pulling children along by the hand. Petronia watched from her shuttered window, Ebrulf beside her, as one such group passed silently through the vale beneath their hill. "Where do they go?" the boy asked. "Where the land still listens," she murmured. "Where the harvest still answers the hand. Or perhaps they follow rumor. Sometimes rumor is all that's left." Among those wanderers there were many tongues. Some spoke broken Latin, others nothing of the old empire's speech. Franks, Burgundians, even wandering Romans who had once owned more than the thin cloaks they now wore. The empire had dissolved not with fire alone, but with quiet disinheritance. The coin had lost its worth, the law had lost its teeth, and now the land itself forgot who owned it. Petronia feared that their quiet would not last, and her fear was not misplaced. It was on a blue-gray morning, just after the frost had receded into the underbrush, that 3 men came up the path to her home. They bore no uniform, no sign of Rome or any lord, but their manner was confident, even careless, as if the world itself had been made theirs by default. One wore a wolf pelt across his shoulders. Another carried a rusted Roman gladius, its hilt stained dark with years of disuse. The third, their leader, had eyes like tarnished bronze, watchful, knowing, dangerous. They did not knock. They simply stood there, waiting. Petronia opened the door slowly, keeping herself between them and the sight of Ebrulf. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice as steady as the stone beneath her feet. "Food," said the bronze-eyed man. "Shelter, if you've it. Perhaps company, if you're generous. I have little to share. Then share little." She gave them bread, what coarse ends remained from the last baking, and a bit of dried meat. She offered no warmth, no seat, only a place by the tree outside. They accepted, though the glances they cast at the door, at the chimney, said they expected more. "We came from Colonia," said the wolf pelt man, his Latin slurred. "No bread there, no coin either, just smoke and silence. They say the Huns will come again." "I've heard," said Petronia. "They always come again." The leader studied her as one might study a puzzle. "You're Roman." "I was." "And the boy?" "My ward. He has no one else." The man nodded. "No one does now." When they left, they took nothing but what she had offered, but their presence left an imprint, like a scar on soft wax, like the world was fraying faster now. The men who once would have been turned away by guards, laws, or shame now moved freely, answering to no one but their own hunger. That night, Petronia did not sleep. She sat by the fire, sharpening the old belt knife, listening for footsteps in the brush. Ebrulf slept with the wooden cross in his hand, his brow furrowed even in dreams. The next morning, a new fear blossomed. The well, which had never run dry, now dribbled only a sluggish trickle. Petronia dug around its edge, clearing fallen leaves, praying it was blockage and not omen. But the land answered with silence. Water, like law, like bread, had become a blessing rather than a certainty. So she and Ebrulf adapted. They learned to trap morning dew on linen sheets. They dug shallow catchments to collect rain. They bartered with passing folk, salt for wax, wool for grain, a tale for a whisper of safer roads. Each transaction was a gamble, a bending of pride beneath necessity. And still, Petronia taught. Her voice, though cracked, wove stories of Aeneas, of lost Troy, of how Rome had risen from ashes once before. She spoke of roads that led everywhere, of arches that held up heaven itself. And Ebrulf listened, his eyes wide, as if the words could rebuild the very stones beneath their feet. In him, she saw not a boy of war, but a seed. A chance, perhaps, for something to endure. Not the empire, but the essence of it. The civitas, the dignity, the memory. For even as Rome crumbled outside their door, within that cottage, its heart still beat, softly, stubbornly, like the flame in a lamp refusing to die. The rains returned in the month once called Aprilis, though the people no longer kept the calendar as they once had. Dates had lost meaning. Only the seasons mattered now. The coming of cold, the sprouting of green, the return of the rains that whispered against rooftops and softened the thirsty earth. In Petronia's cottage, the sound of rain was a comfort. The dripping from the eaves, the gentle hiss of it through leaves and moss, was a lullaby for those who had survived too many screams. Ebrulf would sometimes sit by the window and watch it bead along the wood, his reflection blurry and solemn in the puddles outside. The well had deepened again, fed by the slow melt of northern snow. The chickens clucked with more confidence, and one even laid 2 eggs in a single morning. A small miracle Petronia marked with a quiet smile and a whispered thanks to the old household gods, whose names she barely remembered, but still honored in her own way. Yet peace, even the quiet kind, could not be trusted. One afternoon, as the mists clung low to the trees and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, a horse's hooves echoed faintly up the valley path. Petronia stiffened. A horse was rare, too rare. Those who rode these days were not pilgrims or messengers, but men who believed themselves lords of whatever land their feet touched. Ebrulf peered out the shutter. "He's alone," he said, "but his horse is armored." Petronia wiped her hands on her apron, took the old knife from beneath the table, and tucked it into her sleeve. The rider dismounted before the door, a man draped in a patched green cloak, with a helm that bore the faded crest of the Western legions, though such symbols meant little now. His face was lined, yet unbowed, with eyes that had seen sieges and betrayals. He knocked, not with violence, but with the wariness of someone who had knocked on too many doors and found too few answers. She opened to him. "I seek shelter," he said, "only for the night." "Are you Roman?" she asked. The man tilted his head. "I was born Roman. Whether the world still believes in that title, I cannot say." "Then enter," she said, "but leave your sword by the threshold." He did. The man's name was Flavian. He had once served under General Aetius before the Rhine broke and the frontiers drowned in blood. He had been a cavalryman, tasked with holding lines that no longer existed. He spoke of a legion that no longer answered muster, and of comrades buried beneath snow, beneath silence. Petronia did not press. She poured him broth, and Ebrulf watched him with a boy's cautious awe. That night, Flavian sat beside the hearth, hands outstretched toward the flames. "Rome," he said, "was a fortress of memory, but even memory fades, given time and hunger. I've ridden through cities where marble was pulled down for shelter, where temples became barns. People no longer ask what is just, only what is possible." Petronia nodded slowly. "I have seen the same." "But," Flavian continued, turning his gaze toward the boy, "in some places the seed still survives. Even in ash, something may grow." He stayed only that night, leaving at dawn before the mist had lifted. He left behind a pouch of salt, a precious thing, and his thanks. After he was gone, Petronia found something folded beneath the woven mat where he had slept. It was a piece of parchment, stained and creased, with a passage copied in neat Latin script from the Sibylline oracles. "When the iron falters and the fire dims, yet shall the dawn return from the land of the west." She kept it with her scrolls tucked beside Ovid and the Psalms. Life resumed, but the air felt different. Ebrulf was growing taller, his limbs stretching like saplings reaching for light. He asked more questions now, not just about letters and herbs, but about the world, why it had broken, and whether it would ever be whole again. Petronia answered as best she could. The Empire, she said one morning, as they sat weaving baskets for trade, was never a wall. It was a story of order, of roads, of what it means to be more than alone. Is it still our story? He asked. It can be, if you remember it, if you carry it. Ebrulf looked down at his hands, roughened from work. Then I will. But stories alone could not feed them. And as the spring deepened, bands of settlers moved into the outer forests. Some were peaceful, content to till abandoned fields and mend broken fences. Others were not. Rumors came with passing travelers. A warlord's son crowned himself king in distant Aquitania. Vandals had seized ships on the southern coast. A Roman bishop had been murdered by his own flock. Order was no longer broken. It had become an echo. Then one evening, they heard drums in the distance. Not the rhythm of Roman parade, but something more primal. The kind of beat that stirred ancient blood and silenced birdsong. Ebrulf stood at the threshold, eyes wide. What do we do? He asked. Petronia's fingers were steady as she closed the shutters and stoked the fire. We do what Rome did in her darkest days, she said. We endure. We remember. We wait. Outside, the sky turned the color of cooling iron. Inside, the fire cast shadows on the scrolls and the boy's hopeful face. Somewhere beyond the trees, the drums kept beating. But in that cottage, a quieter rhythm pulsed on, the rhythm of hearts, of hope, of a dream not yet dead. The drums did not pass in a night. For 3 full days, they echoed through the valleys, sometimes near, sometimes far, like waves brushing the edges of the known world. Petronia listened to them as one might listen to the distant thunder of a storm not yet upon the house. And each night she folded the same prayer between her lips, soft, ancient words that once echoed beneath Rome's vaulted ceilings, now whispered in a half-forgotten dialect of devotion. Ebrulf grew tense, his shoulders never quite lowering, his eyes flitting to the window, even when they were safe beside the hearth. The boy had known fear before, of hunger, of abandonment, but this was different. This fear was a shadow without a face, a sound that filled the spaces between thoughts. They did not leave the cottage. The fields were left untended, the forest ungathered. The chickens were fed quickly and silently, and at night they banked the fire low, keeping only enough warmth to sleep, hiding the glow from wandering eyes. On the 4th morning, the drums ceased. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound. Birds did not sing, and even the wind held its breath. For hours, neither Petronia nor Ebrulf spoke. They ate stale barley cakes in silence, listening for a clue in the quiet. Then, as dusk settled like a bruise across the sky, a single rider passed through the lower path of the valley. He did not stop. He did not look. But he wore a helm of blackened bronze and a long crimson cloak that dragged in the dust behind him. His horse was thin but proud, and its hooves struck the stones with deliberate force. Around his neck swung a string of tokens, coins, charms, and bones. Ebrulf, watching from the corner of the shutter, whispered, "Is he Roman?" "No," said Petronia softly. "He is what comes after." In the days that followed, signs of passage marked the land like scars. Trees hacked carelessly, their branches stripped for fire. Ash pits along the river's edge. A broken cart, wheel shattered, its contents spilled and scattered. Once they found a tunic snagged in brambles, torn, blood-stained, but empty of its wearer. The world was bleeding, quietly and slowly. Still, they endured. Petronia resumed her lessons, not because there was peace, but because the soul demanded rhythm. She taught Ebrulf to translate small prayers from Latin into the tongue of the Franks. She showed him how to read the shape of a road, even when it had been overgrown with weeds. How to see where Rome once walked, even when her footprints were buried beneath new earth. There is a difference between ruin and forgetting, she told him. A thing can be broken and still remembered. And Ebrulf, with his young, sharp mind, took to the lessons with fervor. He began to write short passages on birch bark with charcoal. Stories of heroes, yes, but also of bakers, of farmers, of children who found lost roads. He began to imagine a world beyond the ashes. Then one morning, a girl appeared at their door. She was perhaps Ebrulf's age, her face streaked with soot, her eyes sunken but alert. She held a bundle wrapped in linen, too carefully for food, too gently for stone. She did not speak at first. She merely stood, her bare feet bleeding, her breath shallow. Petronia opened the door fully and stepped aside. The girl entered. Her name, they later learned, was Alida. She had come from a hamlet 2 days to the north, once under the protection of a minor Roman lord who had vanished in the last wave of tribal conquest. Her village had resisted occupation, poorly. Fires had come. Then the men with black shields and horned helmets. She had fled alone, carrying the last thing her mother had given her, the bundle she refused to let go of. That night, by the fire, she unwrapped it. Inside was a piece of carved ivory, small, no longer than a finger, a fragment of a larger relief, perhaps once part of a church altar. It showed a winged figure with eyes turned skyward. "My mother said it would protect me," Alida whispered. Petronia took it in her hands, gently, as one might handle an heirloom of forgotten gods. "It may not protect your body," she said, "but it will guard your story." Alida stayed. She spoke little, but listened much. She watched the chickens with a guarded sort of curiosity and slept with the ivory beneath her pillow. She followed Petronia on short walks through the woods to gather moss and herbs. And slowly, as days passed into weeks, she began to hum, low tunes of the kind only children know, the ones that survived even after language itself was lost. Now, with 2 children under her roof, Petronia felt the shift within her daily tasks. No longer a widow merely surviving, she had become something else, a keeper of what remained. A mother not by blood, but by endurance. Abrulf began to teach Alida the letters he had learned. They spoke in a mix of Latin and Germanic tongue, braiding together the words like vines on a trellis. And in the evenings, they listened to Petronia's voice as she read from the scrolls. Ovid, Psalms, bits of Livy, snatches of Virgil. Perhaps someday it will bring joy to remember even these things. Outside, the world continued to change. Forest paths grew thicker. Roman milestones leaned and fell. The road that once led to the city now led only to overgrowth. But within that cottage, a new Rome flickered. Not of empire, not of power, but of memory and mercy. And sometimes, late at night, when the children had fallen asleep and only the fire remained awake, Petronia would gaze into the flames and wonder, was this how the first Romans began? In huts and hopes, with no map but the stars? Perhaps, and if so, perhaps there was still something left to build. The summer came with a gentleness that surprised them all. After the long unrest, the trembling ground of spring, the warmth returned not as fire, but as balm. The trees unfurled their green banners once more, and the valley filled with the hum of bees and the cautious murmur of brooks set free from winter's clutch. It was for a time as if the earth itself had paused to remember peace. The cottage breathed with new life. Alida, who had once barely spoken above a whisper, began to laugh, tentative at first, like a bird testing its wings, then more freely, her voice carrying like chimes in the warm air. Abrulf, now lean and strong with the rhythm of labor, fashioned her a crown of woven clover and placed it on her brow with mock ceremony. "I name you Alida Augusta," he said, grinning, "protector of chickens, keeper of fire, and master of the upper field." She rolled her eyes but wore the crown until nightfall. Petronia watched them with quiet wonder, her heart wrapped in both gratitude and grief. These moments, she knew, were borrowed. The world beyond their clearing was not healed. It still groaned beneath the weight of loss and danger, like a wolf in the distance, never truly left. But in this brief season, she let herself believe that something good might yet grow from the broken ground. They turned the soil by hand, the old Roman plow having rusted beyond repair. They planted beans and onions, cabbage and barley, singing low as they worked. The forest gave generously, wild garlic, sorrel, even a patch of berries not yet stripped by birds or men. They built a crude second shelter with salvaged wood and daub, where the children could sleep when the nights were warm. And still, Petronia taught. Now she taught both of them, and the cottage echoed with dual voices, stammering Latin declensions and naming herbs in 3 tongues. She gave them each a scrap of vellum, salvaged from an old book of saints, and tasked them to write a new history, not of emperors or generals, but of themselves, of their chickens, their walks, the way the moonlight poured through the shutter crack at midnight. "Even if all else burns," she said, "let something of your days remain." But not all lessons came from scrolls. One morning, while gathering kindling, Ebrulf came upon a man collapsed near the edge of the clearing. He was gaunt, his skin mottled with fever, his lips cracked and swollen. Around his neck hung a crude charm, twine-bound and made of bone and red cloth. Ebrulf called for Petronia, who came at once with water and a cloth. The man did not speak. His eyes fluttered open only briefly, and in them was the dim glow of someone far beyond pain, beyond even hope. They brought him into the outer shelter, shaded and cool, and tended him as best they could. He lasted 3 days. In that time, he never gave a name, never uttered a word. Only once, on the second night, he reached toward Petronia's hand and whispered something in a tongue she did not know. His breath carried the scent of rot and blood, and his body bore marks, blisters, swollen glands, a blackened wound along his ribs. When he died, she buried him by the edge of the wood, away from the well, marking the grave with a circle of stones. She spoke no rites. She no longer knew which gods the man had called upon. But she left the charm he wore at the foot of the grave, a gesture of respect. And then she burned the outer shelter. The fire rose high, smoke curling into the clean blue sky. The children watched from the hill, eyes wide. They knew now what death looked like, not only in battle or fire, but in silence. That night, Petronia held them close and spoke plainly. What he carried may come again. We will not live in fear, but we must live in caution. They understood. They boiled every bucket from the well. They cleansed the tools with hot ash and salt. For days they did not leave the clearing, nor did they speak above necessity. Illness had come to the land, not just plague, but the kind that arrived slowly, carried on hunger, on dust, on desperation. Whole hamlets could vanish in a season. Petronia had seen it once, long ago. She remembered the carts piled with bodies, the scent of burning lime, the silence afterward. But memory was both sword and shield. She taught the children not only healing herbs, but signs of sickness. She taught them how to make vinegar from spoiled wine, how to cleanse wounds with honey and cobwebs. She drew diagrams in the dirt, lungs, liver, veins, and showed them where pain began. And in this, too, they found strength. By midsummer, the cottage stood once more as a small island of steadiness. Green vines curled up the side walls, bees nested in the hollow tree nearby. Alida began carving figures from soft wood, a fox, a deer, a woman with a book in her lap. Ebrulf wrote a poem on his scrap of vellum. In ash we planted, and in silence grew, by firelight spoken, the world we knew. Petronia read it and smiled, her eyes wet. The world was still in ruin, yes, but here, in this quiet hollow, they had remembered how to sow, how to shape, how to preserve. And perhaps, if the winds were kind, the story would not end here. The harvest moon rose swollen and golden above the crest of the hills, casting its pale fire over the valley like a blessing from a god long forgotten. The fields, though humble, had yielded more than expected. The beans hung heavy on their stalks. The onions were firm and full. Even the barley, sown with cautious hands and more hope than skill, stood tall in uneven rows, waiting to be cut. It was a harvest of survival, not of plenty. But in these times, that was triumph enough. Petronia watched the children work beside her, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves and the distant chirp of late crickets. Ebrulf swung his blade with growing confidence, the arc of his movement steady, rhythmic. Alida gathered the sheaves into rough bundles, tying them with reeds. She had grown stronger, her arms sun-bronzed, her posture less guarded. The shadow that once clung to her eyes had lightened, though never fully disappeared. They worked together in silence often now, not from lack of words, but from an understanding that silence, too, could be sacred. At twilight, they sat together beneath the old fig tree, their hands stained with earth and grain. Petronia shared out a thin stew of wild mushrooms and onion, followed by dried berries and the last of their goat cheese. A feast, by the measure of these uncertain days. Afterward, as the stars began to prick through the indigo sky, Alida asked a question. Did Rome ever have nights like this? Petronia looked up at the stars, those same stars that had watched over emperors and peasants alike. Yes, she said softly, but the people were too busy to notice. Too busy doing what? Ebrulf asked, half reclining, his arms tucked behind his head. Building, marching, speaking in marble halls, buying and selling things they did not need, writing laws they did not keep. Were they happy? Alida asked. Petronia was quiet for a long moment. Some, she said. Others believed they were. But happiness, I think, is not built with stone. It is built with stillness. The children thought on that, each in their own way. In the weeks that followed, they stored what they could: beans dried and strung in the rafters, onions braided and hung, barley winnowed by hand and stored in clay pots sealed with wax. Petronia showed them how to bury root vegetables in straw-lined pits, how to preserve herbs in oil, and how to smoke strips of meat over alder wood. They were no longer merely surviving, they were preparing. And preparation was its own form of hope. But no season passed without its trials. One morning, as Petronia returned from the woods with a basket of nettles and bark, she saw smoke on the northern horizon. Not the thin, pale smoke of cooking fires, but the thick, dark plume of something larger. A village burning. Or worse. She said nothing to the children at first, but that night she drew the shutters tighter and buried a few of their most precious items in a clay jar beneath the hearth: scrolls, Alita's carvings, Ebrulf's poem, the ivory talisman, a vial of honey. Why bury them? Ebrulf asked, watching her. In case we must run, she said, so that something may return even if we do not. The smoke drifted for 2 days, then faded. They remained untouched, but tension crept in like a draft. The birds grew quiet again. Deer no longer came near the stream. A pair of strangers passed along the lower path, their faces hidden beneath cowls, their pace hurried. One limped, the other looked back too often. Petronia kept the fire low. They spoke in whispers. The children slept with knives beside their bedding. When nothing came, life slowly resumed its careful rhythm. But fear had brushed them again, like the wing of a vulture circling overhead. To distract them, Petronia introduced a new lesson: memory by fire. Each night, by the hearth, they would take turns recounting a day, any day before the fall. Not great events, but small things. A bread seller's song, a festival light, the pattern of a neighbor's tiled roof, a dog that barked only at clouds. At first, the children struggled. They had lost so much so young. But as the nights wore on, their memories sharpened, like iron honed against stone. I remember, said Ebrulf one evening, that my mother used to hide figs beneath the floor mat. Just one or two. She'd say, not for now, only for joy. Alita smiled. My father had a blue cloak. I used to think it was made from the sky itself. And you? They asked Petronia. She stared into the fire, the lines of age soft in the flicker of light. I remember the sound of sandals in the basilica, she said, and the way incense would catch the sunlight, curling like smoke from the mouth of a god. These stories became a ritual, as sacred as prayer. For in remembering, they wove themselves into something larger than ruin, into the long thread of human hope. And one night, as the moon rose high and the owls called across the trees, Alita said, almost in wonder, we are a people again, aren't we? Petronia placed a hand on her shoulder. Yes, child, she said. And that is how Rome truly began. Not with armies or marble, but with firelight and memory and the will to begin again. The first frost came early that year. It crept in quietly during the night, leaving behind a thin silver veil upon the garden soil and the dying leaves of the walnut trees. The breath of morning was visible now, each exhalation a ghost drifting briefly through the air. The chickens huddled together for warmth, their feathers fluffed like cloaks. Even the stream near the eastern edge of the woods had slowed, its edges stiffened by ice. Petronia rose before the sun that morning, as she always did. She stood at the doorway with her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes scanning the mist-cloaked valley for signs, smoke, footprints, anything out of place. The children still slept, curled together beneath thick woolen blankets, their soft breathing steady in the quiet. There was no threat this morning, only cold, only silence. But that silence was never empty. Winter was no longer a season of rest, as it had once been during Rome's golden years. Then, granaries overflowed, and even the poor might find bread and heat in the basilica's charity. Now, winter was a test, a narrow bridge between survival and oblivion. And the bridge was not always wide enough for all to cross. They had prepared well. Their stores were modest but stable. Jars of beans, bundles of herbs, dried fruit wrapped in cloth, salted meat kept in a clay-lined pit. Ebrulf had even caught a wild boar in a pit trap, a catch that had fed them for nearly a month. Still, every bite was measured, every ember of the fire coaxed to last. As the days shortened, the lessons changed. Petronia shifted from stories of empire and law to the knowledge of endurance. She taught them how to read the wind in the smoke, how to gauge snow by the shape of clouds. She showed them how to stitch cloth with sinew when thread wore thin, how to make soap from ash and tallow, and how to keep dry even when the world around them grew wet and cruel. In the evenings, they gathered closer to the hearth. The children, wrapped in cloaks stitched from old tunics, sat at her feet, their eyes wide in the flicker of flame. "Tell us again," Alida whispered one night, "about the boy who saved a city with a single word." Petronia smiled faintly. It was a story from her childhood, perhaps more fable than truth, yet it clung to memory like ivy on stone. In the days of the early empire, she began, when the northern frontiers were wild and full of smoke, there was a boy named Marcus. He was not a soldier, nor the son of a magistrate, just a baker's son, with flour on his hands and a stammer in his speech. The children leaned in. One winter, the town was under siege. Food had run dry. The walls were crumbling. The people were ready to surrender. But Marcus, who had hidden in the granary to escape the cold, heard the enemy plotting through the cracks in the stones. She paused, letting the fire pop. He ran to the forum, breathless, and tried to speak, but his stammer stopped him. The elders laughed. They waved him away. But then a single word escaped his lips: tunnel. And with that, they discovered the plan, collapsed the mine, and drove the enemy away. Ebrulf grinned. So he became a hero? Petronia's smile faded to something gentler. He became a memory, a name passed from voice to voice so that even the smallest soul might remember. Truth, when spoken, need not be loud. Alida leaned her head on Petronia's knee, eyes heavy with sleep. "Will people remember us?" she asked. The question settled into the room like the snow outside, soft but cold with truth. Petronia did not answer right away. "I do not know," she said finally, "but perhaps memory is not only for others. Perhaps it is a fire we keep, even if no one else ever sees the smoke." That night, she woke to a strange sound, a soft clatter, like pottery nudged by a curious hand. She rose silently, the knife ever beneath her pillow, and stepped into the main room. It was only Ebrulf, kneeling beside the fire. He had taken one of the clay jars and was placing something inside, a piece of bark, carefully inscribed with charcoal. Petronia stood quietly, saying nothing until he noticed her. "I wanted to hide it," he whispered, "in case we're gone one day, so someone finds it, so they know we were here." She nodded, slowly. "Then seal it well, and wrap it with hope." He smiled, just a flicker, and did as she said. The weeks passed. Snow came and stayed, blanketing the cottage in silence and white. They ventured out less often. Time was marked not by sun, but by the rhythm of tasks, mending, stirring, reading, whispering. Dreams came more vividly now, as if the cold called up older, deeper thoughts. Alida dreamed of fields, green and endless, where no soldiers ever marched. Ebrulf dreamed of ships, wooden, creaking, filled with books and bread and stars. Petronia dreamed less often, but when she did, it was always of her father's study and the sound of the stylus against wax. Then one morning, the frost broke. A brief thaw spread through the valley. Birds called again, timidly, as if unsure if the silence had lifted. And with the thaw came footsteps. Not many, just one, but the path was clear in the snow, descending from the northern ridge, not made by any of their own. Petronia stood by the window watching. She turned to the children. "Go below," she said gently. "Bring the flask, the old horn, and the cross, then wait." They obeyed without question, for even in peace the world demanded readiness, and the snow, though beautiful, always concealed more than it revealed. The figure came slowly, step by careful step through the snow, as though each footprint must be negotiated with the ground. He wore a cloak of mottled gray, patched and stiff with cold. His head was covered by a hood lined with fur, but from beneath it, a beard spilled out, white as ash, unkempt as wild thistle. He carried no weapon, only a long staff worn smooth by time. Petronia watched from the window, her hand resting lightly on the sill, her eyes narrowed in concentration. She had seen many kinds of travelers since the fall. Fugitives, raiders, prophets, madmen. Each one came with a weight behind their steps, some with violence, others with sorrow. This one came with something else. She opened the door before he could knock. He stood silently, snowflakes melting against his shoulders, his breath pluming in the air. For a long moment, they looked at one another. His eyes were pale gray like a storm about to break. "I seek warmth," he said at last. "Only for a little while." Petronia nodded. "Come, but leave your staff at the door." He obeyed without protest. Inside, the hearth still glowed with banked coals. Petronia added a log, and soon the room brightened with orange light. The traveler sank to the stool near the fire with a grateful sigh, pulling off his hood. His hair was long, streaked with yellowed white, his face lined with the weary map of decades. She poured him a cup of hot water steeped in elderflower and juniper, then sat across from him in silence. "My name is Gaius," he said after some time, warming his hands around the cup, "though I do not know how much of that name remains." Petronia inclined her head slightly. "I am Petronia." His eyebrows lifted faintly. "A Roman name." "So I was told," she replied. He looked around the cottage, at the baskets of dried herbs, the bundles of firewood, the careful neatness of the space. "You've kept something here," he said. "Not just walls, but meaning." Petronia did not answer. She had long since learned that meaning was better felt than declared. Gaius sipped slowly. "I was once a teacher," he said, "in a villa near Mediolanum. I taught letters to the sons of merchants, for coin and for pride." "And now," she asked, "now I walk. Why?" He looked into the fire. "Because the cities are gone, not just in stone, but in soul. The fathers who once read Virgil now trade bread for iron. The children know only fear. But I walk in hopes that somewhere something still listens, that someone still remembers." Petronia felt a stirring in her chest, like the wind catching a flame not yet gone out. "Then you have found what you seek," she said quietly. He looked at her then, not as a stranger, but as one who had feared he would never again find another who understood. In time, she brought the children up from the root cellar. Alida approached him with cautious eyes, her hands still tucked within the folds of her tunic, where she kept the ivory carving. Ebrulf stood taller, protective, the old belt knife visible at his waist. "This is Gaius," Petronia said. "He was once a teacher." Gaius rose slowly and offered a slight bow. "I have little to give," he said, "but I carry words, and I remember the rhythm of books." Ebrulf exchanged a glance with Alida. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and handed Gaius his bark scroll, the one with the poem. Gaius took it reverently, as if it were gold leaf. He read it aloud, his voice soft but steady. "In ash we planted, and in silence grew, by firelight spoken, the world we knew." He looked up, eyes moist. "Then the world is not lost," he said. That night they gave him a place by the fire. He ate sparingly, asked few questions, and offered no grand tales. But before they slept, he told them the story of a city called Arelate, where once a woman had taught her neighbors to read using clay and coal, even as the streets fell into ruin. How she carved the letters into stone so her lessons could not be burned. How long after her death the stones remained. "She wrote not for kings," he said, "but for children who had nothing else, and still they speak her name." The wind howled outside, brushing snow against the windows. Inside, the flame danced and the silence was warm. Gaius remained for several days. He showed Ebrulf how to bind pages together with sinew and wax, forming the rough shape of a book. He taught Alida how to sharpen quills from bird bones and mix ink from ash and elderberry. He spoke of history, not in dates and battles, but in the quiet acts that outlived their authors. He and Petronia sat for hours, sharing fragments of Cicero, scraps of Augustine, broken hymns half remembered. They did not mourn what was lost. They reclaimed what could be found. Then, one morning, as the snow began to melt and the earth sighed beneath its weight, Gaius stood at the threshold once more, staff in hand. "I must go," he said. Petronia did not try to stop him. "Where will you walk now?" "South," he said, "toward the coast. They say ships still sail from Massilia. Perhaps they carry not just goods, but hope." He turned to the children. "You are not lost things," he said gently. "You are beginning things." And to Petronia, he pressed a folded scrap of parchment, yellowed and worn. "A fragment of the Aeneid," he said. "Keep it warm." She took it and nodded. Then Gaius walked into the mist, his footprints joining the countless others that crossed the snow, some fading, some deepening, but all moving forward. In his absence, the cottage felt different, but not emptier. Rather, it felt as though its walls had grown roots, deeper than before. Memory now lived not only in the scrolls or in whispered lessons, but in the breath of those who carried it onward. And as Petronia read the fragment aloud that evening, her voice calm and slow, the children leaned close, not out of fear, but out of faith. Perhaps one day it will bring joy to remember even these things. and they believed it. The thaw came slowly, one brittle layer at a time, as if the world were reluctant to loosen its grip on the cold. Ice clung to the edges of branches like glass, shattering with each gust of wind. The ground beneath the snow turned to mud, rich and black, releasing the scent of buried things. Old leaves, forgotten seeds, the long breath of earth returning to itself. For the first time in many weeks, the stream beside the cottage sang again. It was a thin voice, hesitant, winding between stones, but it carried the sound of life. Petronia stood at its edge one morning with her sleeves rolled and her bare hands in the water, drawing up sediment to test its clarity. The sun, pale as milk, shone faintly through leafless branches overhead. Behind her, the children gathered moss and pulled up the bones of last year's herbs. The thaw was not a full spring. It was a promise, not a delivery, but it was enough to stir movement, enough to hope. They had survived the worst. And with Gaius's departure had come a deepening of resolve. The quiet that followed was not lonely, but purposeful. Each day now had its tasks. Repairing the fence that had cracked under snow, rethreading snares near the edge of the woods, checking the beehive that had miraculously endured the cold. Ebrulf even began to dig a small trench to guide the stream's overflow toward the garden. "We will need water for planting," he said. "And for ink," Alida added, smiling faintly. She had begun drawing small figures on bark and bone, mythic beasts, Roman villas, imagined cities that no longer existed. Sometimes she copied the symbols from Gaius's teachings, layering Old Latin with the runes of her mother's tongue. Petronia, watching them, felt a strange fullness. Not pride exactly, but something deeper, a sense that her story, once brittle with grief, had taken root in others. Still, the world outside had not forgotten them. One evening, just as dusk settled, they heard a sound. Not drums this time, not war horns, but the slow approach of hooves on softened ground. They froze. Petronia stepped to the window and peered out through the gap in the shutter. A rider, cloaked and hooded, led a second horse heavy with packs. The man dismounted slowly, his back bent with weariness, his steps uncertain. He bore a badge upon his cloak, not a Roman eagle, but a stylized sun, painted in gold, cracked with age. He did not knock. He knelt. Petronia opened the door herself. "I ask no shelter," he said, his voice hoarse. "Only rest for my beast and water for my throat." She nodded. "Rest is sacred. You may have it." Inside, the fire was low but warm enough. The children set out a cloth of bread crust and dried apple. The man drank, then sat without removing his cloak. His eyes were shadowed beneath the hood. "My name is Lucan," he said. "Once of the South, though that place bears no name now." "Are you a soldier?" Ebrulf asked, his hand not far from the old belt knife. Lucan shook his head. "I was once a cartographer," he said. "Then a messenger, then a thief. Now perhaps I am only a witness." Alida tilted her head. "What do you witness?" He looked into the fire. The breaking of names, the forgetting of lines, villages that once spoke Latin now trade only in silence. A city once proud now uses its amphitheater as a corral for goats. "I came north looking for something that hadn't been undone." Petronia said nothing, but she poured him another cup of hot water. "You have found it," she said at last. He stayed the night. In the morning, Lucan opened one of his packs and drew out a scroll, tattered, brittle with damp, but marked with delicate ink. It was a map, not of empire or province, but of paths, safe routes, clearings, friendly hearths, marks of danger too, dead roads, collapsed bridges, settlements fallen to plague. "I share it with those who guard light," he said. "You are such." Petronia traced the lines with her fingertip, noting their position, the names scratched in Old Latin and crude shorthand. She showed Ebrulf how to read the symbols. Alida added her own, copying them onto bark for practice. Lucan remained 2 days, then continued on. Before he left, he handed Petronia a small pouch. "For ink," he said. "Ground gall, dried walnut, use it to write what matters." She accepted with a nod. "And if we write, where shall we send it?" He smiled faintly. "Bury it. Leave it under stones, tie it to trees, the wind finds a way." Then he was gone. That evening, Petronia gathered her scrolls, some blank, some only half used. She began writing in earnest, not history but instruction, the gathering of herbs, the boiling of snow, the binding of wounds, the sharpening of thought. She wrote in Latin, but beneath each passage, Ebrulf added the words in the tongue of the Franks. Alida illustrated them, careful lines that turned instructions into memory. And then, when they were done, they bound them. A book, rough, imperfect, but real. On its cover, they etched only 3 words, Lux in tenebris, light in the darkness. Petronia held it in her hands that night as the wind returned to the valley, stronger this time, bearing with it the scent of pine and the distant call of wolves. The world was still breaking, but within their walls, something had been made, something that, even in ruin, might endure. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the hills, casting long golden shadows upon the ruins of what was once a villa, perhaps noble once, but now overgrown with ivy and silent with sorrow. A breeze swept through the broken colonnades, stirring the dry leaves into a soft, rustling dance. Along the Via Flaminia, now overrun by weeds and treacherous cracks, a solitary figure rode a worn mare, her pace as weary as her master's heart. This was Lucan, a former legionary turned wanderer, whose days of service had ended not in triumph, but in the sullen disbandment of a forgotten garrison. His eyes, once sharp with purpose, now moved slowly, searching the horizon not for enemies, but for signs of shelter, of rest, or of memory. He bore the scars of war, on his cheek, his shoulder, and deep within his soul, and in his pack, a small pouch of denarii that no longer held the value they once did. Coin had become dust, and trust a rarer treasure still. Lucan had not always been alone. In the days following the Empire's fracture, he had traveled with a small group, a Greek healer, an Illyrian farmer, and a quiet woman from Gaul who never revealed her true name. They had shared bread, stories, and laughter on the better days. But like mist before the morning sun, they had dispersed, claimed by disease, despair, or perhaps hope that took them elsewhere. Now only Lucan remained, a relic among relics. That evening, he came upon a small hamlet nestled in a valley, surrounded by thin orchards and humble homes with roofs thatched in reed. Smoke curled gently from stone chimneys, and the sound of goats bleating carried on the air. It seemed peaceful, untouched by the convulsions of the world beyond, but appearances had grown increasingly deceptive in these times. He approached slowly, not to alarm, and was met at the edge by a boy of perhaps 12, holding a staff taller than himself and bearing the sharp, wary eyes of someone who had seen too much too young. Lucan dismounted, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I seek only water and shelter," he said, his voice low and cracked from disuse. The boy did not speak, but after a moment turned and gestured for Lucan to follow. He led him to the village's edge, where a woman stirred a pot over a fire and looked up with eyes as tired as Lucan's own. There was no warmth in her gaze, but no hostility either. Just that distant acceptance that had become the common mask of survivors. They gave him water from a clay jug, bread that was dry but welcome, and a place to rest near the fire. No names were exchanged. That, too, had become a custom in a world where people disappeared with such regularity that names had begun to feel more like curses than comforts. As night fell, Lucan watched the stars emerge through gaps in the smoke and cloud. The children of the hamlet, thin and wide-eyed, gathered near the fire, listening not to stories of valor or gods, but to old songs that seemed more like prayers now. One elder, her back bent and her hands like tree bark, sang of a river that once divided lands green and golden, where ships came bearing wine and wool, and laughter echoed through marble halls. Lucan remembered. He had marched through such lands. He had seen those ships, but the marble was cracked now, the laughter silenced. Later, as sleep crept upon the village, a man sat beside Lucan. He was tall, cloaked, with a beard streaked with gray, and a presence that reminded Lucan of old commanders, those who had once believed order could be carved from chaos. "You were Legion," the man said softly, not as a question but a fact. Lucan nodded. "I was too," the man continued, "stationed in Desha, left when the roads turned to mud and the pay stopped coming. I have a son here, and a field that yields little, but it is something." Lucan said nothing for a time. Then he asked, "Do you think it will ever come back? Rome, I mean." The man's gaze lifted to the stars, and for a moment he did not answer. When he did, it was with a gentleness that carried more weight than certainty. Rome was never just marble and legions. It was trust, roads we all used, laws we all obeyed, a sense that tomorrow might be better. When those left us, Rome left us too. What we have now, these villages, these fires, it's not Rome, but it's what remains. Maybe that's enough. Lucan listened, and though he did not entirely agree, he did not argue. because arguing felt like a luxury, and he had grown too weary for luxuries. That night, beneath a woolen cloak in the warmth of borrowed firelight, Lucan dreamed, not of battles, nor of the days when eagles flew above disciplined ranks, but of a garden in his youth where figs ripened on sun-warmed trees and his sister laughed as they chased each other between rows of lavender. He dreamed of his mother's voice, singing in the kitchen, of a dog with mismatched eyes that always found its way back home. He awoke before dawn as the first light touched the sky. The village was still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Quietly, he left a coin beneath the stone he'd used as a pillow. It might not buy much, but it was a gesture, a whisper of the world that once was. By the time the sun rose, Lucan was gone again, following the road where it led toward another uncertain day. The hamlet faded behind him, as all things seemed to do now, yet in his heart, something small and stubborn stirred. Not hope exactly, but perhaps its shadow. The road twisted through a thinning forest, its path half swallowed by moss and memory. The trees stood silent sentinels above, branches outstretched like weary arms, as if they too were trying to hold back the march of time. Lucan's mare trudged on, her steps muffled by the thick underbrush, and he guided her with a gentle hand and softer voice, for both beast and man were creatures of aching limbs and hollowed hearts. As mid-morning light filtered through the green canopy, he reached the remnants of what had once been a roadside way station. The stone pillars were half toppled, choked with vines, and the tiled roof had long collapsed into itself. But carved into the lintel, still barely legible beneath the lichen, were the words Refugium Viatorum, Sanctuary of the Traveler. Lucan dismounted and led his mare to drink from the stagnant basin of a broken fountain nearby, where rainwater had collected and small frogs chirped with absurd cheer. It was in places like these, half-forgotten thresholds of a lost world, that the ghosts whispered loudest. Lucan sat upon a fallen column and unwrapped a heel of bread from his satchel. He ate slowly, savoring the faint sweetness of crushed figs baked into the crust, and let his mind drift as it often did these days, backward, endlessly backward. He remembered when the roads were lined with merchants, when one could stop at such a station and find stewed lamb, fine oil, laughter echoing off stone walls. He had sat once at a wooden bench not unlike this, sharing olives and wine with a cavalryman from Hispania who sang when drunk and cried when sober. The man had died in Thrace, or perhaps it was Moesia. So many had fallen, it was hard to keep the dust of memory from blowing into a storm. From the trees, a voice came, soft and low, hesitant. "Are you alone?" Lucan turned without haste. A young woman stepped forward, barefoot and slender, with a tangle of auburn hair and eyes dark like wet earth. Her tunic was threadbare, and she held a woven basket filled with herbs and early mushrooms. "I am," Lucan said, his voice calm. "And you?" She gave a cautious nod, stepping nearer but not too near. "I gather for the apothecary in Cumae. He's blind now, but still knows more than most. I was sent to find Tansy and Yarrow." Lucan glanced at her basket. "And did you find them?" "Enough for a tincture, not enough for the old man's liking." She paused. "You're not from the coast." "No, from nowhere in particular anymore." A silence passed between them, not uncomfortable, but weighty. The kind of silence that, in better times, might have preceded an invitation to share a drink or a tale. The girl, she could not have been more than 20, sat beside him, unbothered by the broken stone. "I used to come here with my mother," she said after a while. "She told me the emperors once sent riders here to rest, that they were gods in all but name." Lucan smiled faintly. They bled like men. Some cried like boys. She looked at him as though trying to read something buried deep beneath his skin. "You fought." "I survived." The girl did not ask more. She, too, had the look of one who had lost enough to know when silence was the gentler companion. A wind stirred the leaves above them, and the mare lifted her head, ears twitching. Somewhere in the woods, a raven called, sharp and solitary. The girl stood, brushing soil from her knees. "If you head south," she said, "the bridge near Sinuessa still holds. Past that, the roads are clearer." Lucan nodded. "And you?" "I'll take the long path back. Safer that way." She turned to go, then hesitated. "Thank you for not being a bandit." He chuckled softly, the sound rasping from disuse. "And thank you for reminding me the world still has kindness." Then she was gone, her steps light and quiet as a doe's, vanishing between the green shadows. Lucan lingered a little longer, listening to the hush of the land around him, until even the birds grew quiet. Then he stood, slung his pack across his shoulder, and mounted once more. He took the road south, as she had said, and by dusk the sea came into view, a gray shimmer beyond the hills, lined with the black spines of abandoned villas. It had been years since he last saw the sea, and something inside him loosened at the sight. A memory rose, unbidden, of his brother and himself as boys, racing along the sands of Ostia, flinging shells into the waves. His brother had died of fever during the siege of Mediolanum. Lucan had buried him beneath an olive tree. He found shelter that night in the skeleton of a lighthouse, its flame long extinguished, its stairway broken. But the walls still stood, and they offered reprieve from the wind. He lit a small fire in a circle of stones and watched it crackle, watched the embers dance as stars emerged one by one above. Somewhere, a wolf howled, a long, low sound that echoed off the hills. Lucan's mare stirred but did not flee. The night held still, and as he stared into the flame, Lucan felt something stir within him. A flicker, not of hope, but of purpose. Perhaps he would find Cume. Perhaps he would meet the blind apothecary, offer his strength for food and a bed. Or perhaps he would ride on until the road ended or the sea swallowed him whole. Whatever came, he would meet it. Quietly as always. With the patience of stone and the memory of Rome still burning, faint but defiant, in the corners of his heart. The sun rose pale and reluctant over the water, its light diffused by the mist curling off the sea like the breath of ancient gods. Long silent, but not quite forgotten. Lucan stood at the broken archway of the lighthouse, cloak drawn close against the dawn chill, watching the tide pull gently at the ruined harbor stones below. Once, merchant ships had jostled for position here, sails emblazoned with sigils from Africa, Greece, and the distant lands beyond Gaul. Now only gulls circled, and the masts that pierced the water were bones of vessels long sunk and stripped by time. He descended the path slowly, leading his mare by the reins, her hooves clattering faintly against worn cobblestones. The air tasted of brine and ash, and the smell stirred something beneath his ribs. Not quite sorrow, not quite longing, but that nameless ache that accompanied too many of his waking hours. A raven watched him from atop a column, head cocked, as though to ask whether he had forgotten what world he now walked through. By midday, he reached what remained of Cume. The town, nestled among ancient hills and steeped in myth, had weathered the storms of the centuries better than most. Its walls still stood in places, patched with brick and timber, and life lingered within the folds of its crumbling streets. There were children chasing stray dogs through alleys, their laughter uncertain but real, women hanging faded linens from balconies, and the scent of lentils cooking over hearth fires. Traders, few and desperate, hawked dried figs, crumbling amphora, and relics looted from tombs too forgotten to guard their dead. Lucan passed beneath a tattered awning to where a man with sightless eyes sat cross-legged beside a stall of tinctures and dried plants. His hands moved with the precision of long habit, sorting leaves and crumbling roots into small clay jars. "You've come far," the apothecary said without lifting his head. Lucan blinked. "I have. From the north by the weight of your steps." Lucan nodded, forgetting the man could not see. "Yes. The roads are empty." "Not empty. Just changed. What they carry now is not trade and law, but memory and loss." Lucan crouched beside him. "A girl told me of you. She gathers for your table." "Ah," a soft smile creased the old man's face. "Mira, she has her mother's feet, quiet as snowfall, and her father's stubbornness, which has saved her more than once. I met her at the way station. She gave me direction, kindness. And you came seeking." Lucan hesitated. "A place to rest, a purpose, maybe." The apothecary nodded slowly. "There are herbs in the marshlands that must be gathered before the solstice. My hands fail me now, and Mira's father is buried among them." "I can help," Lucan said before the silence grew heavy. So he stayed. The days passed with the rhythm of simpler things. Lucan learned to boil bark until it bled its secrets, to recognize the scent of rot from the scent of remedy. He carried water, split wood, repaired fences. When storms rolled in from the coast, he helped lash down the thatch and guided livestock to higher ground. The people of Cume came to know his presence as quiet, steady, and useful, the kind of man who asked for little and gave what strength he had without question. Mira returned each week with her basket of woodland findings, always with the same steady eyes and mud-streaked tunic. She spoke little, but Lucan saw the way her shoulders eased when she saw he was still there, how her voice softened around the apothecary, whom she called uncle, though no blood bound them. One night, as rain tapped gently against the shutters, Lucan sat near the fire, sharpening his old sword. Not for war. There was no war left, only violence, but because he could not forget the feel of its hilt in his hand. The apothecary sat opposite him, fingers resting on a steaming mug of chamomile. "You know," the old man said, "there was once a temple to Apollo on the hill above Cumae. The Sibyl lived there, keeper of visions, voice of gods. They say her final words were not a prophecy of conquest, but a lament. She saw the world not ending in fire, but in forgetting." Lucan glanced up. "Do you believe it?" The apothecary smiled faintly. "I believe memory is the truest power, stronger than armies, deeper than time." Lucan considered this. Then quietly, "I remember every man who died beside me. I remember their voices, their laughter, the color of the sky above them. Then they're not lost." For a long moment, the fire was their only voice. Outside, the rain whispered across the stone streets, and the sea murmured to itself beyond the hills. In the weeks that followed, Lucan ventured further, into the marshes, the overgrown trails, the broken villas now dens for wolves and silence. He brought back roots thick with cure, leaves that trembled in his grip but calmed fever in the gut. The work tired him, but it was a good weariness, the kind that settled into the bones like warmth rather than burden. And each time he returned, there was bread left for him, a jug of wine, a place by the fire. Not grand tokens, but in this world, they were gestures that meant everything. One morning, as he approached from the south path, he saw children playing near the town gate. One of them pointed and cried, "The soldier returns!" And a few others came running. Lucan laughed then, a true sound, unshaped by sorrow. It startled even him. He lifted one of the children, a boy with tangled curls, and spun him once before setting him down. The child beamed, and the others laughed. That night, as the stars returned, Lucan sat beneath the same broken archway where he had first entered Cumae. Mira sat beside him, knees drawn to her chest, her hands stained with the green of crushed herbs. "I used to think Rome would rise again," she said, almost dreamily. "And now?" She looked at him. "Now I think. Maybe it never left. Not completely." Lucan said nothing, but he watched the stars shimmer in her eyes, and in that moment, he allowed himself to believe she might be right. The summer crept gently over the hills, and the world, though broken, moved still in its quiet, sacred rhythm. The scent of wild thyme drifted on the wind, bees hummed lazily over the fields, and each evening in Cumae ended with a sun slipping soft and gold into the waiting arms of the sea. Though ruins still rose like ghosts among the olive groves, there was life between the stones, small, stubborn, beautiful. Lucan rose early now, often before the roosters, walking the paths alone with only the whisper of his thoughts and the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath his feet. He'd become part of the village, not by declaration but by presence, unspoken, understood. The children no longer stared at the old sword on his hip. The elders nodded as he passed. He was no longer the wanderer. He was, simply, Lucan. Each week, the apothecary's ailments grew more persistent, though he never complained. His blindness had long since become a part of his life, rather than a burden, but his breath grew shallow and his limbs thin. Mira began spending more time by his side, grinding herbs, heating compresses, and whispering songs her mother used to sing. Lucan watched it all with the quiet ache of inevitability, feeling the shadow of something approaching. One evening, as the light turned amber and birds called softly from the fig trees, the old man took Lucan's hand in his own. His grip was cool, delicate as parchment, but firm with intent. "You must stay," he said, "even when I'm gone. She needs you." Lucan nodded, though no promise had been demanded. "She's strong," the old man continued, "but strength does not mean solitude. The world's torn her family from her. Don't let it take more." Lucan swallowed, his throat dry. "I won't." The apothecary smiled faintly. "Good. You've carried war on your shoulders. Let peace rest there now. It's heavier, but worth the weight." That night, the man slept and did not wake again. The morning in Cumae was not loud. There were no great wails, no procession of priests. The people gathered in the square beneath the half-collapsed temple where moss had begun reclaiming the steps. They lit candles made from tallow and beeswax, placed wildflowers around the stone where the apothecary's name had been scratched in soft Latin script, and sang the old songs. Mira did not weep in public, but her silence was deeper than before, her steps slower. Lucan stood beside her, his presence a shield of wordless comfort. As days passed, they returned to their patterns, gathering, healing, tending, but something had shifted. The apothecary's hut became Mira's. The tinctures bore her mark now, not his, though she used his recipes and spoke to him aloud when she worked. Lucan built a small shelter nearby, close enough that she would never be alone, far enough to give her space to mourn in her own way. One afternoon, as they sat beneath the twisted boughs of an old olive tree, Mira spoke, her voice gentle. "Do you think it's over?" Lucan looked out toward the horizon, where smoke no longer rose, where the road stretched quiet and empty. "I think the world we knew is over," he said. "But this might be the beginning of another." She nodded slowly. "Do you miss it? The legions? The banners?" He paused. "Sometimes. But more than that, I miss the certainty, knowing who I was, what I was meant to do, the sound of command, the clarity of discipline." "And now," Lucan turned to her, "now I wake to birdsong. I build things instead of breaking them. I eat food grown by hands I trust. I've found more honor in mending a fence or helping a child than I ever did in battle." She smiled then, the first real smile in many days. "You sound like someone who belongs." Lucan returned the smile. "Maybe I do." As the seasons turned, the world outside Kume continued its slow unraveling, but within the village, there was a sense of holding on. Travelers came and some stayed. Fields expanded. A school formed beneath the shade of a linden tree, where an old priest taught letters from salvaged scrolls. Children learned not just to survive, but to dream. Lucan became a teacher of sorts, not of letters, but of history, of balance, of how to turn fear into steadiness. He taught the boys how to bind wounds and the girls how to use a blade if needed. But mostly he taught them to be still, to listen, to understand that strength came not only from the sword, but from knowing when not to draw it. Mira's garden flourished. Her medicines grew sought after, even by distant villages. She began to travel again, with Lucan always nearby, the two of them companions not only in purpose, but in the shared understanding that they were building something new from the ashes of the old. One twilight, as they stood on the bluff above the village, watching the sea shimmer beneath the dusk, Mira reached out and took Lucan's hand. Neither spoke. They simply stood, joined by silence, by loss, by the strange and sacred peace that had bloomed in the cracks of their broken world. The fall of Rome had scattered millions, broken cities, and drowned empires. It had brought fire and famine, despair and darkness. But here, in this place under these stars, something had endured. Not Rome, not its marble or its might, but its people, their memory, their quiet, relentless will to live, to mend, to dream. And that, perhaps, was the truest empire of all.